Welcome everybody to day 4 of the Sanitation Workers Forum, and a very important session today on connecting labour rights and sanitation. So I'm delighted to be joined by an array of fantastic speakers today for this workshop, including Carrión-Crespo, David Kapya, David Boyce, and colleagues at the Centre for Equity Studies, Harsh Mander, and Vidit Verma, Suresh Garamella, and Utkarsh Mishra, as well as colleagues who are involved in a documentary film on manual scavenging deaths in India, including Natasha Badhwar, Anam, Sheikh, and Sandeep Yadav. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for this very important discussion today. And just to say that some of the issues we'll be talking about will be upsetting. This is real world cases we'll be talking about of sanitation worker deaths and injuries. And the premise of the session was really to try and highlight some of the labour rights violations and labour rights issues from the labour sector, and try and transport that into our understandings and learnings of what we can do to support sanitation workers. So we'll be discussing a range of topics from occupational health and safety, looking at worker organisation, looking at compensation, looking at legal claims in the case of sewer worker or sanitation worker deaths and injuries. So really trying to understand through the lens of workers and labour what we can do to better support sanitation workers as we go forward. So the workshop today will be divided into two main sections. The first part will kick off with some presentations from colleagues at the International Labour Organization. First off, Carrión-Crespo, who's involved in public services, utilities and telecommunications, at the Sectoral Policies Department in the ILO, will talk us through some findings on a background paper that's been recently conducted on sanitation workers, particularly in the South Asian region. We'll then break for a short discussion and reflection on that paper with Carlos. After that, we'll go into a presentation from David Kapya, Carlos's colleague at the ILO, who will talk us through the results of the South Asia workshop that the ILO recently ran to look at some of these issues in the sector. That will be followed by a talk from David Boyce from Public Services International, who will then talk further about their role in promoting worker rights, especially around organisation for workers. We'll then again break for a bit of discussion before going into a live documentary film screening. And the film is titled Death by Drowning in a Sewer, Socio-Legal Autopsy. And that's been created by colleagues at the Centre for Equity Studies in India. And colleagues will talk us through the film, including an introduction from Harsh, and then also talk us through some of the cases and challenges they faced in further detail. So that's how we'll be running the session today. So to get started, I would like to introduce Carlos and ask Carlos to take the floor for his presentation. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. You can present the slides. So my name is Carlos Carrión-Crespo from the ILO. I had the pleasure of organizing the workshop on decent work for sanitation workers in South Asia. It was organized together with our decent work team in New Delhi for South Asia. And we had participants from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. So we're going to, we prepared a background note providing a snapshot of the situation surrounding the sanitation workers and the legal framework around them. So I'll go quickly through it. Could you please go to the next slide? So we had an identification of the issues and objectives, the issues with database, the magnitude of manual sanitation work, the profile of sanitation workers in South Asia, the limitation of employment and labor surveys data, the economic insecurity, health hazards, stigma, constitutional and legislative provisions, ratification of ILO conventions, and the emerging challenges and the way forward. And this quote summarizes what we found. It's in India, a man is not a sanitation worker because of his work. but because of his birth, irrespective of the question whether he does sanitation work or not. You can go to the next slide. So we have that in the different countries, we have a diversity of percentages of sanitation workers in the total workers. And perhaps surprisingly, the highest number was Maldives, and the lowest was Bangladesh. You can, next slide. And then we found also that by age group, most of the workers are in the mid-level, age group, but we had in yellow, you see here, the group of workers that are in the over 60 years old. And we found that in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, the numbers of over 60 was higher. You can go to the next slide. By sex, we found that in India, almost half of them are women. And in Nepal, it's the next highest amount. But then in Pakistan, the vast majority of them are men with 85%. Next slide, please. But then we go towards the attitudes that are faced by these workers. Particularly in Bangladesh, we found that the attitudes toward Hindu untouchable sanitation workers affect them very seriously, because the attempts by them to move away from sanitation work to seek alternative livelihood are received with opposition. The efforts to start, for example, a tea stall or other businesses, they were boycotted by the high caste, similar to that of India, and that self-employed sanitation workers do report humiliating treatment. Some household owners do not even offer them water when they ask for it. And when they pay money, they put it on the ground to avoid touching the sanitation workers. Next slide. And then the question is why? And then in India, we see that when we talk about shit, they talk about impurity, pollution, and this is profanity of the ritual purification. And Hindu culture requires the removal of shit as far as possible from the household environment. And those considered most impure and polluted, the lowest caste, must perform this task. This is one of the reasons also why you have so many problems with outdoor defecation, because they don't want to have the feces close to the home. But then the majority of the sanitation workers are from the majority religious community of the country. Hindus in India and Nepal, Muslims in Bangladesh and Afghanistan, and Buddhists in Sri Lanka. In Pakistan, the bulk of sanitation workers are Christians and Hindu Dalits, who are religious minorities there. So there is a diversity in this area as well. But there is a caste religion interface, which is common in some South Asian countries. The Hindu ex-untouchables, because they're not considered, the word untouchable is not used anymore, and former untouchables who converted to other religions constitute a sizable proportion of sanitation workers in India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Next slide. So we see that the religious background of sanitation workers, we only have the data for Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. We found that in Sri Lanka, the majority are Buddhist, but, and then in India, the majority are Hindus. And this is the other bar is the percentage of the total population. That's the blue bar. And then that means that, for example, in Sri Lanka, the Hindus are a higher proportion of the sanitation workers than of the total population. And the same we can see in Bangladesh for the Muslims, in which they're pretty much tied. You can go to the next slide. And then the percentage of sanitation workers by religion and caste system in India, which is where we have more detailed information, is that the Hindus are the untouchables, and the non-scheduled caste have a proportion that 62% are what they call scheduled caste, which is the former untouchables. But then in the Buddhist population, the vast majority are of that scheduled caste. You can go to the next slide. Now, by ethnic background, we find in Sri Lanka that as a percentage of the population, the Sinhala are more than as a percentage of the sanitation workers. But with Tamils, which are a minority, the difference is quite substantial in terms of the percentage of sanitation workers that are Tamil is much higher than the percentage of the general population. You can go to the next slide. By education level, we find that in the vast majority are illiterate or less literate, meaning that they are below primary. That was surprising in the workshop for the Maldives employer representative, but that's what we found, that the vast majority of the sanitation workers in Maldives is below primary school, and even more in Afghanistan. But then in Sri Lanka, then we found that a large percentage have high school education. And then in India, we actually found 2% of them who have higher education, which is university. You can go to the next slide. And then we also found that there's a good amount of sanitation workers that are employed by the government. In the case of Afghanistan, up to 82% of them are employed by the government. In India, the majority of them are. In India, the railroad system is perhaps the largest employer of sanitation workers in the country. However, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, it was the opposite, in which the majority are in the, I'm sorry, this is in the blue one, is the public sector. In the Pakistan and Bangladesh, the vast majority are employed by the public sector. In Afghanistan and India, the vast majority are employed by the private sector. Sorry, I confused the bars. Go to the next slide, please. Now, the biggest problem that we found was the percentage of sanitation workers without job contracts and without social security. That equals to precarity. As you can see, in India, 77% of them don't have even an employment contract. And in Nepal, it's a similar amount. But then we also see a large group that doesn't have social security, even if they have an employment contract. So this is perhaps the biggest challenge that we identified, and it is tied with the demographic aspects that we saw. Please go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so then when we see then the comparison between those who are without social security and who are employed by the public sector, we find then that a lot of these workers, even if they are employed by the public sector, they still do not have social security. In India, we find that it's 72% that are in the public sector and who do not have social security. In Bangladesh, it's 78%. So it's quite a striking factor that people think that because you are employed in the public sector, then you are going to have a social security. But when it comes to sanitation workers, that is not the case. You can go to the next slide. So these are the factors that we see in terms of discrimination. It's related to occupation. All the countries we found that the fact that they are sanitation workers causes the stigma. And then when it comes to caste, then we find that it's not so universal, but there are 2 countries in the group that that do not have, that we didn't find that relation, but in the other countries, yes. Based on religion as well, based on of having a higher proportion of males is not so high. It's the majority, the 4 of the 6 countries, 3 of the 6 countries, or 4 of the 7 countries, I'm sorry, do not have that relation. But when it comes to having the female high share of sanitation workers, then we find a slightly higher. So it is based on occupation and caste that we find a bigger relationship with discrimination. Next slide, please. So what have the countries done? The ILO has a good amount of conventions that are directly relevant to the work of sanitation workers, to the protection against discrimination, forced labor, child labor, low wages, etc. So we can see in the first group, these are what we call the fundamental conventions, conventions that every country needs to comply with, even if they do not ratify them, because they are the core principles of the ILO. So as you see in the green, most countries have ratified these conventions and also have adopted laws that promote these values, but they are of general application. They are not dedicated for laws for sanitation workers. Now, when we look at the technical conventions, which is the protection of wages, migration for employment convention, the minimum wage, migrant workers, occupational safety and health convention, promotional framework for occupational safety and health, and the violence and harassment convention, which is the most recent one from 2019, then we find that most countries have not ratified them. And have not adopted legislation to protect workers in these particular areas. So there is a stark contrast between these basic principles and the actual application of these principles in a more specific manner through technical conventions. So this is something that we found that really needs to pay attention. So next slide, please. So what are the main risks that sanitation workers face, the main challenges and opportunities that participants face in addressing these risks, and the gaps in knowledge regarding sanitation workers? This was the discussion that we had in the workshop. And the results of that discussion is what David is going to present. Thanks for your attention. And now I give the floor back to Sandeep.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for a really interesting and important presentation, especially the laws ratifications at the end, which was very helpful. I want to open the floor now for around sort of 8 to 10 minutes for Carlos to answer any questions on this, just to get your feedback as well on that study, and any questions or comments that you may have. Please post those in the chat or in the Q&A. Just to get us started, while attendees have that chance to post their questions, Carlos, could you talk a bit more about the methods behind the study and a bit of background on how it was conducted? Thank you.
It was mostly a desk research in which the author looked at, the author was Sukadeo Thorat from India. He He works a lot with Jayati Ghosh, who you probably know. And he did mostly desk research. And this is where the main challenge was finding data, the demographic data. And we had to do a review, and he did a few interviews. But then the idea was to present a snapshot in order for the participants to have information about what happens in the other countries. Because one of the issues when we talk about South Asia is that they are a bit isolated among each other. And then one of the features of these meetings is that we have the participation of labor ministries, labor unions, and employer organizations, most of which actually do not have contact with sanitation workers. So it was a good opportunity to present them with this reality that is not what they normally see, because sanitation workers are invisible. So in this sense, the background note did present a good opportunity to expose people who are not normally exposed to these situations.
Thank you, Carlos, for the background information. And we have a question coming in from Nelly LeBlond, who says, thank you for such a compelling analysis and clear presentation. Were other countries included in the research too, especially African countries? And from what you've just said, that might not be the case, but could you tell us a bit about that, maybe applicability to other contexts?
Yeah, well, we did have in the workshop some participation. Well, Sonia Diaz participated, and she exposed about the Brazilian context, and we did have some input from other countries, but this workshop was dedicated to them. Where the information about other countries is found is in the initial assessment that we conducted together with WaterAid, the World Bank, WHO, and SNV in 2019.
Okay, thank you, Carlos, for clarifying on that. Are there any more questions from any of the participants? If you want to raise your hand, you can also do that to ask your question, or please post it in the chat or Q&A. David, yes, please, you have a question for Carlos. Thank you.
I do. It could be Carlos, could be David Kapya. Can you talk a little bit about how ILO and its various services can help to deal with the informal workers? As we know, the ILO is comprised of 3 constituent bodies: the governments, the employers, and trade unions. And so the non-organized informal workers are left out of that. Can you touch on that a bit? Thanks.
Yes, quickly. We do have a recommendation on the transition from the informal to the formal economy that was adopted just in this decade, let me tell you, in 2015. And that recommendation was the result of a very thorough discussion about the issues around informality. And we do have a promotional campaign on this. And so we do have departments that address the issues around sanitation work, around informal workers. And after this workshop, and this is something that David's gonna talk about, we do plan to do follow-up activities that will focus also on sanitation workers, particularly coming from the South Asian region. I do have to say that the reason why we chose South Asia is because this is the one region where the sanitation workers, even though they are generally invisible, their plight has been called attention to precisely by the ILO's constituents. And then we do want to expand it, but it is in that office, it is in that region where we were more likely to get assistance from the office, because that is where they do a lot of work. So we do have programs in the South Asian region, particularly in India, to address the plight of informal sanitation workers.
Thank you, David, for the question, and Carlos for your answer, your detailed answer. We have a comment from Harsh Mander. Harsh, would you like to ask your question directly to Carlos? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. The study was very interesting. I just wanted to say that there's something peculiar about South Asia, and that is that this work is highly stigmatized and unsafe and unprotected in many ways, but that communities are compelled to do this because of their birth into a particular community. So the conditions of unsafe and undignified work, unprotected by law, would exist perhaps in many parts of the world, but has ILO encountered a situation in which being compelled to do this work because of the accident of your birth in any community, does this really exist in any other part of the world?
Indeed, it does. As I mentioned, we did, together with World Bank, WHO, an initial assessment. And I'm trying to find it here. So then we did studies in several African countries, and we found similar situations. I do know that, for example, in Ethiopia, it is migrants who do this work. I'm going to put the link in the chat box. I need to say that it's to everybody. So you can open the link now. Today I was prepared to talk about South Asia, but the study identified quite a few countries that are quite interesting. Now, in the case of South Africa, we found that there's more formal sanitation workers employed by the municipalities that enjoy rights to collective bargaining and more dignity in the work, more social protection, etc. But I'll tell you now, we studied Bangladesh, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Haiti, India, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, and Uganda. And we found this phenomenon in all these countries.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think that relates back to Nelly's question about looking globally at other intersections of marginality that intersect with this kind of work. So that's really helpful. Thank you. And a comment, and also thank you, Karsh, for your question. A comment from Andres saying, in some countries in Africa, excuse me, we have also heard accounts of sanitation work being associated to particular ethnic and allowed also tribal groups. So that's a good point, Andres. Thank you for sharing. We do have a Q&A from Elena, and I think this might have to be our last one before we move on to the next presentation. But Elena's asking, is there a link / report regarding the finding of caste and religion distribution?
Okay. Is that in the chat box?
And that's in the Q&A. So Elena's just asked a question in the Q&A. Is there a link / report regarding the finding of caste and religion distribution?
In this background report, we do have that. We did find that. We do provide the link. So David, if you can post in the chat box the report, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Fantastic. So Thank you very much. And if anyone else has any comments, please put them in the chat as we move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Carlos, for sharing that. And I think the next presentation from David Kapya will build on what you've been talking about now and share some of the key findings from the workshop itself. So thank you again, Carlos, and I'll pass on to David to share your screen to start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And as a continuation of what transpired in the workshop, here the results and what was agreed upon. And as mentioned by Carlos, we had representation from all the social partners, the three social partners. We had 7 government representatives, we had 8 employer representatives and 15 worker representatives. Some of the organizations, worker organization and employer organizations that attended include Dakar Wasa Employees Union, Nagpur Municipal Corporation, SEWA, Indian National Municipal and Local Bodies, Workers Organization, Public Sector Employees Federation of Pakistan. We had representation from Nepal, Local Labor Employees Union and PSI. Among the employer organizations, we had Bangladesh Employers Federation, India Sanitation Coalition, All India Organization of Employers. We had National Federation of Maldivian Employers, Federation of Nepalese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and Employers Federation of Ceylon. So like Carlos said, you can, from the list, you can tell that maybe most of these workers and employers organization somehow at a macro level, they may not very much be aware of the issues that are happening in the sanitation workers, with the sanitation workers, and that's why it was important for us to come up with a background note. The general objective of the workshop was to generate synergies, and this Carlos has talked about, but the structure of the workshop, we had across the 3 days. On the first day, we explored the main risks facing sanitation workers and the main challenges and opportunities social partners encounter in addressing the risks, as well as the existing knowledge gap. Day 2, we delved in the issues on the efforts taken by governments and social partners in respective countries. And on the third day, the workshop tried to devise strategies and that the ILO governments and social partners can adopt to create opportunities in the sector and address some of the challenges. So on day 1, in terms of risks and challenges, and you'll find that most of these issues, if you've been attending this forum, have been coming up now and then. So we talk about informality and precarity of employment, poor working conditions, and lack of access to freedom of association and collective bargaining, even for workers in formal employment, as alluded to by Carlos. Outsourcing, externalization, and privatization is creeping in, and which we know that can lead to poor working conditions, precarity, and lack of access to the fundamental principles and rights at work. Lack of personal protective equipment, we have risks of physical injury and illness, lack of social security, social stigma and discrimination, which is rampant. Lack of recognition of the work of sanitation workers. There are no specific laws targeted to the sector and the workers in sanitation value chain. There's lack of professional training and lack of formal market for the profession. There is no alternative livelihoods for these workers. They are excluded from the labor force and the labor market. There's high instances of poverty and illiteracy, lack of attention to discrimination based on gender, migration status, ethnicity, caste. And we also heard from Wilson that also race is a big issue. Lack of unionization, lack of ownership of the problem and accountability. And this was highly talked about, like acknowledged as a major issue, because there is no one to point to in addressing these issues when the government and local municipalities don't, for instance, try to own this problem when in fact it is a public service. Lack of investment in sanitation infrastructure and lack of resources for adequate staffing, PPE, and wash conditions. The sustainability of interventions was a problem as well, challenge, because some of the interventions are ad hoc and short-lived, and there was need to strategically plan the interventions from short-term, medium, and long-term interventions. And then we have the knowledge gap and lack of data. On the second day, some of the interventions, the actions that were raised included that the fact that there's an increased awareness about the needs and interests of sanitation workers, and COVID played a major role in that. There's an existence of labor laws, but these are like general and not specific in some of the countries, except for maybe India. But there is also a disconnect between these laws where they exist. Especially an example of India again, where the laws exist, but the application of those laws are not enforced. There've been efforts to fight privatization in the sector. As earlier mentioned, the COVID pandemic has raised the profile of sanitation workers as essential to society. There've been some efforts in some countries to develop policies for the sanitation sector, especially concerning the regularization of undocumented immigrants. And this was, Maldives was specifically mentioned because most of these workers are undocumented migrants. There have been some efforts also to rehabilitate manual scavengers. India was singled out as well in that aspect. And on the third day, after the 2 days, there were like clear priority areas which were identified. And these include that there is need for greater formalization and professionalization of the work of sanitation workers. There's need for improvement in the working conditions, the need for investments in skills development and reskilling. There's need for investments in sanitation infrastructure and adequate staffing in decent work conditions. Investments in technology was important. The technologies which are relevant to the sector, such as robotics, which is tied also to the mechanization of the sanitation value chain, an issue that has been brought up in the course of this forum. There's need for more engagement with governments and social partners to promote social dialogue in the sector. And this was very important as well because of the different dynamics in the respective countries. Greater sensitization and awareness raising campaigns on fundamental principles and rights at work, national laws and WASH principles. There is need for dedicated outreach strategies to help deliver materials to sanitation workers. And this also, I've been following this forum, and there's need. There was also talk about the occupying spaces, and that issue somehow is related to that aspect. And the strategies that were developed that participants of this workshop endorsed, we included that there is need to encourage governments to take full ownership and responsibility of sanitation services as a vital public service, fully integral to water provision and water stewardship. Governments should ensure the full recognition of sanitation as a vital public service to preserve public health, water resources, and the environment, as well as the economy. And we should advocate for governments and employers to provide and maintain adequate PPE and uniforms to workers at no cost to the worker. Advocate for decent work in the sector and link it to SDG 6 on water and sanitation, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, and SDG 11 on sustainable cities. Need to advocate for the formalization and professionalization of the sanitation work. We need to develop specific national and sub-national frameworks and legislation to be introduced in dialogue with all social partners involved at all levels of government. Ensure that if everywhere sanitation workers are in formal employment relationship. Even where sanitation workers are in formal employment relationship, they are enabled to access decent work conditions, invest adequately in sanitation and water infrastructure, enabling equitable access to quality sanitation services to work together with decent working conditions for workers. There's need to develop long-term commitments. This was important, to encourage and support workers to organize and bargain, because organizing and aspects of bargaining are long-term aspects that need commitment, partners that can commit over long periods of time. Conduct research on the impact of privatization on working conditions of sanitation workers. Conduct research on the status of sanitation workers in the context of COVID-19. We need to promote formal skills development, education, and vocational training program to facilitate the participation of sanitation workers in the formal labor market. And the last four was to find creative and socially valorizing names to replace socially degrading names associated with sanitation workers. And there were examples in the workshop that were presented, but we picked on these two. Like in Brazil, they are referred to as pickers of recyclables. In Senegal, they are referred to as environmental technicians. There is need to appoint sanitation workers as ambassadors of sustainability and environmental protection, and create opportunities for them to speak in public spaces, such as schools. So like there's this, to demystify the stereotypes and stigmas that are associated with them. We need to create linkages between sanitation and water, public health, and food systems to build alliances. And lastly, to promote information and knowledge sharing on best practices at the regional level. And that's what came out from the workshop. Thank you very much for listening. You can find the full report on the ILO website. I've shared the link to the background note, and back to you, Sally.
Thank you very much, David, for sharing those really useful insights from the workshop. And I know that we have some people here who attended that, but it's really great to share that on an open platform like this for others to learn from. And the point you made about names and what names we use is also a very, very important one that maybe doesn't get enough discussion. So thank you for raising that, David. Just for sake of time, I'll go straight on to David Boyce's presentation, and then please do in the meantime post any questions or comments for David, Kapya in the chat. But I think a nice segue would go straight into David. Thank you, David, for your talk.
Thanks, Sally, and to your team for the energy and focus on sanitation workers, and for bringing us together. And to Carlos and my namesake, David, for really solid work in the South Asia workshop. Look, these workshops take a ton of work to put together. As you've seen, there's a whole bunch of background research. It takes months, it takes validation. It's really an enormous amount of work to get that level of detail. I guess if I was in the corporate world, I would say that level of granularity. But okay. Look, Public Services International is a membership-based global union federation with over 700 unions from 160 countries, representing some 30 million working women and men who built and sustain PSI. I'm going to go through a little bit of background because I'm assuming a lot of people only have partial knowledge of trade unions, but the fact is that trade unions in most countries are legally bound to negotiate and help implement collective bargaining agreements. These agreements set the terms and conditions of employment of the union members in most cases and of other workers in some cases. These collective bargaining agreements have the force of law. So this means that the unions need a counterpart to negotiate with, whether a government entity or a private corporation. We need somebody on the other side of the table to bargain with, and some organization that because there's the force of law, are recognized by the legal institutions. And this basically means that unions have an almost impossible task to negotiate terms and conditions for informal workers, because there is no counterpart to negotiate with or ensure compliance. Now, unions also defend labor rights, which are enshrined in the UN Declaration and in the ILO Conventions, as Carlos showed. But those who aren't familiar with the work of unions typically hear about us when we go on strike or organize big demonstrations. And typically that means that there's a failure somewhere in the system, that whether it's organizing workers into unions or negotiating and defending collective bargaining agreements, that when you see us on the streets, it means that something has failed. It's by far not the most important work we do. Now, union work in public services needs to consider the dynamics of the various levels of government, of electoral processes, et cetera. That's because the terms and conditions and respect of labor rights for public service workers are determined in part by the policies and practices of the elected officials in the legislative and executive branches, as well as the interpretations made in the judicial branches. So unions in public services thus need to engage in political processes to defend the terms and conditions of their members. And more, unions in public services are aware that their interests, the interests of their members, coincide with those of their communities, because public services are one of the bonds that build communities, that support our collective efforts, and are designed to offer everyone a fair and equal chance in life. Now, I think some of the analysis that the ILO has presented show some challenges in how we define our public services and how we implement them. But the main thing we've seen is we have now experimented with 40 plus years of a neoliberal view of the world, which posits that we need to shrink government small enough to drown it in a bathtub. That was one of Ronald Reagan's advisors who said that. That the market, the for-profit sector, is much better at delivering services because cutthroat competition drives efficiency and innovation. And that by acting as consumers, individuals are better able to defend their right and exercise freedoms. But what we've seen is that privatization actually increases inequality, in part because the for-profit sector has an imperative to maximize profits and to divert profits to shareholders and inflated salaries and bonuses for senior management. Look, maximizing profits means that poor people and poor neighborhoods don't get services. Maximizing profits means that workers' wages and conditions need to be cut to the bone, whether it's through outsourcing or a range of other tools. And maximizing profits, sorry, I don't know why I need to put my phone on silent. Maximizing profits means that it is cheaper to ignore labor and environmental regulations, as the risk of getting caught and the fines associated is much less costly than actually complying. And we've seen some worrisome behaviors also by public entities that sort of copy this view. But look, for us, the problem is that this focus, this 40-year focus on markets as the solution to all, means that government spending and investment has been limited. We see that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank conditionalities imposed on developing countries impose that governments change their laws to facilitate privatization and protect investors, that they advise the governments to discredit and dismantle unions in public services, and then they impose austerity measures to shrink public spending. The result is that too many countries have not invested in formal infrastructure for water supply and sanitation, not to mention health, education, and other fundamental public services. But here we're talking about water supply and sanitation, and the investments haven't been made. Look, we also need to consider in our analysis the colonial histories of current global trends, because all of these impact on sanitation workers. Despite being declared a human right, most governments are either unwilling or unable to make the investments to build out formal sanitation systems. So for PSI, the realities on the ground are linked to global and regional and national political processes. And you know, we've just come back from the climate summit in Glasgow. We're desperately dealing with yet another wave of COVID. We're seeing more conflict around the world. But what we're realizing is that unless we focus on our democratic institutions to make them deal with the needs of the people, the needs of the planet, and not just protecting the profits of the few, we're not going to solve these issues. I mean, Kapya showed a really long list of recommendations, and we will work on those. But we've got to understand that the work outlined there needs to be accompanied by a serious political analysis and political work to make sure that sanitation workers, water workers, public sector workers, the unions build links in the community to insist that governments deliver the services we all need and deserve. Because if we don't have that broad view, we're going to be chipping around at the corners, trying to make small changes, but the system will not change. And part of the problem is that we've let the system slip too far away from families, away from communities, away from what the planet needs. So what we suggest is, yes, we've got to strengthen the unions. Yes, we've got to formalize the informal workers, but all of us have to recognize the need to be politically active in our communities to make changes, whether it's in city governments, in state, provincial, in national, and those who can, those who are able to pressure the international, the global communities, which are more and more focusing on making space for, whether it's now the financial corporations or a whole range of other corporations that have just too much power relative to what we need. So look, that's my contribution to this this workshop. I understand, Sally, that it's probably a little bit off the track that that you were trying to take us, but I think if we don't address these, then we're basically tying our hands behind our back as we try to work on this most fundamental area. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic, and not at all taking us off on a different track. I think it's really helpful to have that bigger picture perspective and some of the complexities around privatization. And as you said, also the historical colonial kind of elements as well, which we've picked up on in our first day of the workshop as well. So no, thank you very much for your really insightful comments. I want to open the floor to any questions before we move into our second main part of the workshop. So would anyone, no problem, Carlos will have to leave us, but if you do have any pressing questions for Carlos, please do post them anyway, and we will make sure that he receives those. So thank you, Carlos, for joining us, and we'll see you again. Are there any questions for the two Davids in the chat, or please also raise your hand and I'll let you speak.
I'm going to have a question for Kapya.
Please go ahead.
Kapya, based on what I've said, how can you see ILO positioning itself in its very complex dynamic, representing where employers come in mainly as labor market regulators? Where governments come in mainly as labor market regulators. I see Carlos is still there, so he might provide some wisdom as well, where employers come in mainly as private sector. So this is a huge challenge for ILO, where we're trying to get the people responsible for major policy changes to come to the table. And look, I think some of the commitments made in the South Asia workshop, I'm hoping they're not just words on paper. How can ILO put some of its muscle and its technical expertise to deal with some of these things? Over.
Do I go first, Carlos?
Yes, please do. Because I do need to move.
Yeah, thank you, David. And indeed, like, ILO is in a special place with the way it's constituted to bring these social partners who are very influential and play a pivotal role in all these things that we are talking about. But and it's important that the ILO doesn't just remain a referee in the discourse. And in that sense, we will continuously play our role and promote, for instance, the labor standards that we have developed. And there are a number of them, like Carlos showed, which are very particularly relevant to the sector. We'll continue with the sensitization process and appealing to our stakeholders, especially to governments, to see the relevance of adopting and ratifying some of these labor standards and domesticating them, and not just domesticating them, but in a way that is relevant to some of these sectors which are predominantly informal. That is one way that I would see as the role that we could be playing going forward. And we've been talking about this already with our counterparts in South Asia. In the next biennium, we are taking some of the points that which came up from the workshop, the recommendations, and we are talking about like how best we can get some of these things, some of the points which are very relevant to the ILO or specific to the ILO, which appeal to the ILO's mandate, and take them forward in the next biennium. It's just that at the moment we haven't finalized the work plan, so it's kind of like premature for me to point out the kind of activities that we intend to carry forward. But there is work in the background that these things will pick on some of the points that came out from the workshop, and we hope that the other stakeholders, the partners that attended the workshop, also will also take on some of these issues. And in the next year, we know, for instance, that there is an interest from SNV to work with I think, if I'm not mistaken, Nepal, the government of Nepal, because the government representative from Nepal was very specific in terms of trying to showed interest in the sector itself, and they talked to the need to take up this work, and there's an email that has been sent to them already to try and see how best they can work together. But as ILO, we are very much taking this work forward in the next biennium.
Thank you, David. And we've just had a question come in from Andres for you, David Boyce. Andres says, an issue we've heard from Pakistan and India is that formal sanitation workers participating in unions struggle to get their voices heard within those unions, probably linked to part of the stigma mentioned. And Andres wanted to hear any reflections from you, David, that you might have about these issues and ways to address it.
No, that's right, Sally. But first, Kapya, thanks for your answer, because by all means, PSI and our various unions will continue to provide input to the priorities and plans of ILO in this. I mean, the work started has really set a path, and we need to prioritize that as well. And in part, look, this applies to the question of Andres, because as some of the ILO data showed, the amount of workers involved is tiny compared to the tourist industry, or compared to food service, or compared to the health sector. And so how do you get, first of all, big institutions like the ILO, like PSI, and in some instances like national unions in public service, to focus on a tiny percentage of the population, as whether it's a population in terms of overall workforce, or a population in terms of in terms of the national country or the workforce. So clearly, for the work of ILO, we need to continue this because the impact on workers is so dire, and the impact on the environment and on the communities, the families that depend on informal sanitation, is also pretty dire. So that is despite the small numbers overall, that is why we need to continue this. Now, in terms of unions, look, unions are similar to other to governments in the sense that they are democratic institutions where there is voting to elect leaders, to select policies, to choose priorities, to determine how budgets are spent. And so what we find across PSI is that when you have water and sanitation workers organized in their own unions, those unions are typically really small, because water and sanitation does not take a ton of workers. It takes key workers, but it doesn't take a lot of workers. And so if the union is too small, then it doesn't have the muscle, as it were, the organizational tools to expand its voice across the political spectrum, whether it's just in mobilizing members for demos so that media pay attention to us, or for preparing solid negotiation, or for figuring out how to organize new workers. And this is a reality of the labor movement. And because we are funded by member dues, which is a percentage of their salaries, in many countries, we see that there's just not enough money even to have an office. I've been to unions where their office is actually a closet. And it's mind-blowing that the activists continue to do it. In big unions, you're absolutely right, Andres. It's really tricky for a small segment, for the tail to wag the dog in the positive sense, for a small segment to have its voice taken up as a priority. And so I think this is where the political process that a lot of the NGOs on this call and associated with the sanitation work is actually very helpful, where the pressure on building visibility on this issue is such that even the big public service unions realize, okay, we've got to allocate some of our precious resources to doing that. But finally, let me say that the structure of PSI is such that the unions in the rich country subsidize us and allow us to focus more of our energies also on strengthening unions in countries where there isn't enough money, where the unions aren't strong, or where the unions are especially have their rights attacked by various entities, whether governments or corporations. So yes, we want to see the level of intensity of sanitation and water supply and sanitation, SDG 6, rise. And I think that's where NGOs have a solid role. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you very much, David, and other David, for your excellent presentations. There is one remaining question in the question and answer, but if I could ask you, David Boyce and David Kapya, to maybe answer that by typing your answer, that would be really helpful, because we need to move on now to part 2 of our segment for this workshop. So thank you again to Carlos, David and David for your excellent inputs. So the second part of the workshop, as I mentioned, will include a documentary film, which I'll shortly let Harsh introduce, and a presentation from colleagues at the Centre for Equity Studies in India. We've been working together over the last year or so, looking at real cases of sanitation worker deaths in India. So the next segment of the workshop is going to be dedicated to looking at this in the Indian context. And as I mentioned in the session blurb, this will be real life cases, and the documentary is quite emotional, as it should be. So please be prepared for that and respectful of that as well. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Harsh Mander to please introduce the film, and then we will play this film, followed by a presentation from other colleagues at CES. So Harsh, if I can hand over to you, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Harsh.
Okay, I lost you for a minute. Are we into the second part? Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, can I just, so friends, I was fascinated by the discussion that we just heard. I think it does lay down some of the ground for the study as well as the film. I only wanted to say that the complexity of the condition of manual scavengers in South Asia is that they are some of the worst oppressed workers, lacking any kind of labor rights and labor protection and safety and social security, and they're forced to do work that is contravenes human dignity. But the complexity is that they're forced to do this not out of choice of birth, but because of the accident of their birth in a particular caste. This is an oppression that goes back millennia, and even those in other parts of South Asia are often people converted into egalitarian religions, but which still carry the stigma and this responsibility. So that's one thing. Women in India from this community are forced to clean human excreta with their hands. And men in large numbers are forced to clean septic tanks and sewers with very little safety. There are laws connected with their caste to protect them, their labor laws, but all of them bypass them. And I think that just in the very brief time, we read in our newspapers now every few weeks maybe about 4 sewer workers dead in a sewer here and 2 there. It's very important for us to remember that they are workers, but even more than that, they're people. In today's day and age, a death in a sewer is literally drowning in excreta. That human beings are forced to live this way is something that should be intolerable to society, to all of us. And the reason that we undertook the study was to highlight not just the caste, but also the labor violations. But what the film tries to do is to remind us of the human tragedy that each of these deaths actually signify. And these are places which I had also visited, families which I have visited, and I think in a few minutes you will get a sense of of the labor law violations, the social violations, but most of all, the human tragedy.
Thank you, Harsh. Anam, one of the filmmakers, will now share the documentary, and then we'll have a presentation following that. Thank you.
वाल्मीकियों का क्या काम है? सफाई का काम है। जो अच्छा पढ़ा लिखा है, जो अच्छी जगह जॉब वगैरह लग गई तो वो जॉब कर रहे हैं, नहीं तो बाकी बात यही काम है।
हम चाचा ताउन की हम 10 दौरानी जेठानी हैं और 10 हो जाते हैं अलग अलग।
भाई एक भी दुकान तो भी नहीं खोल सकते ना हम लोग। अगर दुकान वगैरह क्यों लोगा नहीं कोई। अगर हम मार्केट में अगर कुछ काम करें, मार्केट में नहीं लगाएगा हमको कोई दुकान पे।
बस झाड़ू लगाते हैं, झाड़ू लगा कचरा उठाते हैं और फिर उसको फेंकने जाते हैं। फिर फेंक के आएंगे तो कोई एक रोटी मिलती है, कुछ नहीं मिलता है। वैसा वो होता है कपड़ा कूड़ा बनने का, तो उससे भर के ना एक हाथ से झाड़ू एक से कपड़ा भर के ना उसमें डले में डाल देते हैं।
दिसंबर में ये घटना हुई थी 2017 में। नगर पंचायत सुपरवाइजर आया था उसे बुलाने, तो एक उसका अन्य साथी भी था विकास, उसके साथ वो गया था सीवर टैंक में सफाई का काम करने के लिए। तो वहाँ बताते हैं कि उनको अंदर घुसेड़ा उसकी सफाई के लिए। घुसेड़ने से तो पहले विकास जो गिर गया था उसमें, फिर मेरे भाई ने उसे निकालने की कोशिश करी तो वो भी गिर गया था उसमें।
हाँ, हमारे लोगों ने बताया करे कि तुम ना घूम रहे, तुम्हें लगा जो होगा टैंक में गिरा, वहां ले गए हॉस्पिटल लेके भागे। खुली गाड़ी के अंदर, कूड़े वाली गाड़ी होती है उसमें डाल के ले गए। फिर हम आगे गए तो आगे भी लोगों ने बताया कि तुम्हारे लड़के हैं जो नंगे उसमें गाड़ी में डाल के ले जा रहे हैं।
इमरजेंसी जब हमें पहुंचे इमरजेंसी में, तो वहां देखा तो उनकी बहुत ही ज्यादा गंभीर हालत थी। इमरजेंसी में डॉक्टर बोलने लगे कि अगर तुम्हें इन्हें बचाना है तो प्राइवेट में ले जाओ जल्दी। तो विकास को उसके परिजन ले गए जसवंत हॉस्पिटल में, और हम अपने भाई शनि को माँ भगवती हॉस्पिटल में ले आए, जहाँ उसका उपचार चलता रहा। विकास की दूसरे दिन मृत्यु हो गई, मेरे शनि की उपचार चलता रहा। पाँच 6 दिन बाद उसको डॉक्टरों ने बोल दिया कि ये बिल्कुल ठीक है। तो उसको लेकर हम घर पे आ गए। उसके दूसरे तीसरे दिन उसकी तबीयत खराब होती है, हम माँ भगवती हॉस्पिटल उसे लेकर गए, तो वहाँ माँ भगवती हॉस्पिटल में उनने मना कर दिया, एडमिट नहीं किया। फिर वहाँ से हम लेके गए उसे इमरजेंसी में डॉक्टरों ने चेक किया तो बोले ये डेथ हो चुकी है उसकी।
Basically, people die in cleaning sewers because the noxious gas is generated. And I found that if at all, if there's any, and that also is rarely done, they put a candle inside. And if the candle gets extinguished, they realize. But even that very, very minimalist kind of safety effort is not normal. And so people just get in and faint and die. And I need to say this clearly, you know, what are sewer deaths? You look at the doctor's report, it's actually death by drowning. So they actually die drowning in shit.
यहाँ से ये बोल के गए थे कि मैं काम करने जा रहा हूँ। अंदर घुस के उसमें शिविर में अंदर घुस के पता नहीं क्या कर रहे थे। अंदर घुस गैस लग गई उनको, तो वो अंदर गए तो उन भतीजे से बोला था, उन्होंने क्या कहा मुझे निकालो, तो उसने हाथ दिया तो वो कहा मैं छोटा गट्टा था मतलब, तो निकाल नहीं पाया, तो वो भागा घर पे गया। तो घर पे भाई वगैरह सब आए थे भतीजे, उन्होंने निकाला। बहन का लड़का है वो अंदर चला गया, उसको भी गैस लग गई थी। जब मेरा भाई का भाभी का आया था, भाई का लड़का, उसने बताया कि उनका झगड़ा हो गया। उन्होंने ये नहीं बताया कि वो खत्म हो गए। ये बोला था कि मतलब झगड़ा हो गया बुआ उनको, फूफा जी का, उनके टांग में लग गई है, उनको हॉस्पिटल में भर्ती कर दिया। और ये बताया था, मुझे बाद में पता लग गया खत्म हो गए। जैसे अंदर शिविर में चले गए थे सब लोग, जैसे जो जानकार हैं वो लोग बोले थे इसके अंदर पानी डालो, पानी से मतलब कुछ हो जाती होगी। तो उन्होंने पानी भी नहीं दी ना, फिर उन्होंने नालियों का पानी भर के, जो नाली चल रही नालियों से भर के पानी उसमें शिविर में डाला।
ये सोसाइटी का घर से कितना दूर है ये टैंक?
पास में ही ऐसे काफी में घर है उसका, जिस साफ कर रहे थे ऐसा टैंक है।
वो घर से पानी भी नहीं दिया?
नहीं दिया पानी भी उन्होंने।
घर में कोई थे? हाँ
थे, उन्होंने ही साफ करवाया था। अब वो तो वर्षों से पता नहीं कब तक, करीबन 20 साल का हमारे उनको हो गई करते हुए काम। पहले इन्होंने स्कूल में काम करा था, स्कूल में बंद छोड़ा लिया काम, फिर जाके मैं यहीं सोसाइटी में लगे थे। उसके बाद कर्मयोगी में। हाँ,
कर्मयोगी सोसाइटी में क्या काम करने गए?
ये नाली साफ करते थे, झाड़ू लगा देते थे, शिविर करते थे।
सोसाइटी में वो एम्प्लॉय थे?
हाँ, बार बार गई, मुझे काम से लगा लो, मैं परेशान हूँ, मुझे काम से लगा लो। उन्होंने तो तुम नहीं कर पाओगे, लेकिन उस समय उन्होंने बोला था कि तुमको काम पे लगाएंगे हम, और बच्चे तुम्हारे बाद मतलब बच्चों को लगा लेंगे, बच्चे समय तो हो जाएंगे। उन्होंने ये नहीं कहा। मम्मी थी मेरी भी, मम्मी ने मुझे गले लगाया, ससुराल वालों ने सबने मना कर दी थी, जब हमारा लड़का नहीं है तो फिर तेरा क्या होगा। फिर मम्मी ने मेरे गले लगाया, मम्मी ने मेरे बच्चे पाले, मम्मी ने मुझे जीवन बना के दिया। मेरा घर मम्मी ने देना, जब मम्मी भी गुजर गई।
In almost every case, there is no written record at all. There's no written agreement. There's no kind, and the kind of wages they're paid is absolutely unbelievably low. But also that there seems to be no desire on the part of the employer to provide even the elementary safety equipment and safety measures.
What is scavenging, which we are all thinking about? We are thinking about just sweeping all other things. And we are thinking, no, I am talking about making another human being to clean the human excreta by hand. It is happening everywhere in the country. The day when we are sitting and talking, 1.6 lakh women, today morning also they have cleaned. And it is 5,000 years we are cleaning.
हमें एक ढाबा वाला बुला के लेके, वो इसने ही सफा करवाया। तो माने कि कितने पैसे लोगे, तो कोई 7 फुट का करीब गड्ढा था। तो तेका तीनों लोग चले गए। तो उसमें जाने के बाद हमने तेका जो भी थोड़ी सी हमारी जो अकल से जो काम करते हैं, जैसे कि नीम का लहरा वगैरह, वो भी दिया। उससे कोई गैस वगैरह भी नहीं थी उसमें। फिर उसके बाद जैसे सफाई वगैरह कर दी हमने, पूरी सफाई करने के बाद अतः का है थोड़ा सा मलबा रह गया उसके अंदर, तो मैंने कहा इसको भी निकाल देते। तो लड़का गया भीतर, तो 1 बाल्टी उसने दी। उसके बाद वो लड़का उसी में नौका की नौका रह गया। तो उसके बाद मैं भी चला गया नीचे उसे उठाने के लिए। उसे उठाने के बाद जैसे जेटम भरा, एक लड़का ऊपर था, तो उसके हाथ में आया नहीं, तो हम दोनों लड़के वहीं वहीं रहे। हाँ, फिर उसके बाद पता नहीं किसने निकाला किसने नहीं निकाला क्या।
तो ये हम लोग पहुंचे हैं, तो ये 2 बंदे हमें टैंक के अंदर ही मिले। हम जाके घुसे उसके अंदर, तो लड़का सबसे नीचे था और ये एक साइड में पड़ा था इस तरीके से, और वो नीचे था। तो वहां जाके देखो तो नीचे गड़ रहा, तो मैंने कीचड़ में से ऐसे करके मैंने उसकी बनान यहाँ से पकड़ के नहीं खींच के नहीं, मेरी हिम्मत बिल्कुल टूट गई। एक बंदे ने कही थी क्या, बोले ऐसा है रस्सी बांध दो इसके हाथ में, हाथ टूट जाओ कोई बात ना है, पर आते ही तो रिपेयरिंग है, इसे खींच तो लो बाहर। तो वो जैसे तरीका से रस्सी हाथ में बांध के नहीं, जब वो बाहर खींचो, बाहर देखे तो उसमें कुछ नहीं था।
मालूम होती तो मैं जान देती नहीं। जो कहूँ मैं तो रोटी बना के खाना बना रही, तो मैं आवाज दे रही हूँ गोविंदा 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 हो, तो बोले जो कहोगे गोविंदा नहीं। फिर हमारी पड़ोसन बोली कि तू गोविंदा आवाज दे रही है, गोविंदा तो कहूँ गड्ढा खिला के गयो। जब मैं पहुंची तो मैंने जो कहा ये मैंने मेरे गोविंदा कहाँ है, कि गोविंदा भाई मैटर मैं कि भाई वो फिर ना उस रहा होगा का है और का ना हो।
तो प्रधान कह रहा बोल बेटा ऐसा मत करियो कि बढ़िया से बढ़िया तुम्हें मुआवजा दिलवाएंगे, पर लेकिन बेटा जो कुछ होना जानो वो तो है वो।
अब देखो मैं क्या, गरीब लोग वैसे तुम्हें पता है, अब हम क्या कह सकते।
1-2 दिन बाद माननीय एससी आयोग मंजू दिलेर जी और माननीय एससी चेयरमैन रामशंकर कटेरिया सांसद जी आए। उन्होंने हमें आश्वासन दिया कि दोषियों के खिलाफ सख्त से सख्त, कड़ी से कड़ी कार्रवाई कराई जाएगी और आपको रहने के लिए निवास दिया जाएगा और नौकरी दिलवाई जाएगी। ना ही तो निवास मिला, ना ही नौकरी मिली और ना ही उन दोषियों के खिलाफ कोई कार्रवाई हुई। कोर्ट में वारंट चल रहा है पर अभी तक किसी की अरेस्टिंग नहीं हुई है।
We have almost like a 650 districts. So the district magistrate has to punish the person who engages or employs the manual scavenger. But all these years till today, we have not punished even a single person. Not even a single person. We have the courts, we have the police stations, we have the ministers, we have everything in this country. But we have not even punished even a single person, at least a single moment in across the country.
मगर जो गांव की है ना, सबसे ज्यादा छुआछात ज्यादा चलती है ना यहाँ पे हमारे गांव के जी वाल्मीकि है जी पंडित है जी, वो है सबसे ज्यादा चलती है।
काम करके रोटी मांगनी पड़ती है कि रोटी दे जाओ हमको। हाँ बुला लेती हैं, बहुत सी प्रेमी होती हैं कि जी तू आ जा, यहाँ बैठ जा, घाम पड़ रही है, यहाँ बैठ जाओ तुम, प्यार खा लो पंखे के नीचे। सब तरह के हैं देखो, बहुत सी छीत करती हैं, बहुत सी नहीं करती हैं, सब तरह के हैं देखो, ऐसे कह रही हैं हमको। विच्छित करती हैं, तो उनसे मैं कह देती हूँ कि देखो तुम भी इंसान है, हम भी इंसान है। यूँ तो है नहीं है कि उंगली काटो तो खून एक ही निकलेगा, यूँ तो है नहीं है कि अलग निकलेगा। तो इनके कोई को समझ आ गई है, तो वे खुद कह देती हैं जीजी ना बैठता, पानी पी लो।
Well, thank you, Anam, for sharing. And as I told everyone at the beginning, this is quite upsetting, and it should be, because this is real life cases where justice is not being done. So without saying anything else, I think we can maybe just go straight into Vidit, Suresh's and Utkash's presentation to talk us through a little bit more about these cases, and also then finish off with some Q&A on this at the end. Thank you. Vidit, over to you.
Thank you, Sally. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. So that was a powerful documentary. After having done the field work itself, I think all of us rewatching it like was quite powerful to us again. Here in this presentation, we'll be talking about the sanitation workers, and more specifically the manual scavengers, who do a very specific kind of scavenging sanitation work, which involves cleaning of human fecal matter. So give you a bit of perspective of manual scavenging in India. Historically, it is a caste-based work in which primarily women were supposed to do scavenging, which involved going to each household in the village or the town they were living in, women from that specific caste, which is the lower caste women, and they were supposed to scrape off the human feces from individual dry latrines, which were called insanitary latrines in the legal parlance, and they would then carry that human fecal matter on their head and then dispose it off at the city limits or the town limits. So this practice had been, as Wilson in the documentary had said, has been going on unabated since thousands of years now. This has been banned by the government, but on practice, it still is there in some villages. The work that is called manual scavenging. So manual scavenging is defined by a law which came out by a central government law, which came out in 2013, which is a quite strong law, and it defines manual scavenging as manual scavenger as a person who comes in direct contact with human fecal matter. So that definition actually expanded the scope of manual scavenging and included anybody who would do cleaning of human excreta, or not even cleaning, who would get in touch with human excreta without a list of equipment which was provided in the act. So now what happens is that the nature of work is changing, and the manual scavenger, the categorization of manual scavenger has expanded after that act. Those dry latrines that we are talking about, in which women were supposed to scrape off, they are getting demolished, and their number has gone down drastically in a few years. But now a new kind of nuisance has been created, in which is actually becoming rampant now, provided the public policy impetus to it, with the state sanction to it, which is called septic tank. And septic tank is a toilet which is not connected to the larger sewage system, drain system of the city, but a tank where the human fecal matter would be collected over a period of time. That time could be 1 year, 2 years. And when the tank is full, it is supposed to be clean because you need it empty to be filled again. So that cleaning, as per the central government regulations, is to be done by machineries. But in practice, that is not how it happens. So essentially, anybody who would go and clean the tank would be a manual scavenger. So point being that now men are also manual scavengers because of cleaning of septic tanks. Even though there is demolition of old dry latrines, the new septic tank toilets can be construed as insanitary latrines. And earlier, the dignity was never something that this profession had. Also, by the virtue or the curse of the caste, has always played the underlying factor why certain community was doing this work. This work has now become lethal also. Earlier, it was not lethal. Now, as we saw in the documentary, like men die doing this work. This work has become lethal. So just a brief about the work that we have been doing. In 2018-19, we did a ILO study in which we looked at the implementation of the act, which is called the Manual Scavenging Act of 2013. And very short implementation of the act, lack of understanding on part of public officials also, what the act means, who is a manual scavenger, how they are to be rehabilitated. It's as if everybody has shut their eye with respect to this issue and believe that everything is fine and happy. We also covered 20 case studies of death of manual scavengers doing such jobs. They were primarily cleaning septic tanks. And we found out that the regulations are in place. The documents are in place in terms of the legal framework, but in terms of implementation, the actual happening of whatever is said as per law is very obscure. In fact, we saw in the documentary that even post-death, there is no dignity in death. The person who died, his body was taken in a garbage truck because they could not arrange anything better. Probably they believe that he did not deserve anything better. So that was the first project we were working on. And this the current project this year was with Sally, which we were working with. We are looking at a few cases of deaths of manual scavengers. And now we are looking at the legal cases that were filed and what were the impediments to the legal justice. And legal justice is not just some amount of compensation given to the families of victims, but a larger justice in terms of prosecution of the employer or the prosecution for the state and anyone who was responsible for the happening. So we are examining those cases from that framework. To move forward, as we saw, we can categorize manual scavenging workers, manual scavengers, into 3 different categories based on the employing terms in terms of their employers. For example, one could be by the state. For example, a person can be employed by the municipality, the local municipality. They could be on their payroll or even subcontracted by the municipality. And then they are called to do manual scavenging work. Another category could be that the sanitation worker is employed by private establishments, which could be housing societies, for example, or private factories. And then they are called to do that cleaning of septic tank in that establishment or somewhere else. And third category could be that the most vulnerable are not employed anywhere. They're casual laborers. For example, in the last case that we saw, he was just called to do the work of emptying the septic tank because he belonged to that caste. So there exists no protection whatsoever in the third category at all. All this work is caste related. For example, who would be cleaning the septic tank of the factory if there are 10 workers in the factory? It's the person who's from the singular caste. So nobody, manual scavengers, I don't think, manual scavengers don't have labor rights because it's a prohibited profession. But sanitation work also remains, the labor right for sanitation work also remains quite shoddy. I would hand over the floor to my colleague Utkarsh, who would take you deeper into labor rights.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to attempt to situate whatever Vidit spoke about within the accountability of various government bodies and the rights of sanitation workers within a broader framework of labor regulations. So it will be a more general presentation. So as Vidit mentioned, there are three kinds of sanitation workers. Now, if the work is of a contractual nature, then as sanitation work usually is, then in order to avail any labor protections, it is essential to prove an employer and employee relationship, which is usually absent in the most rampant forms of manual scavenging that we have encountered. So now, next slide. So now the central government has stated that there are over 100 state and 40 central laws regarding various aspects of labor, such as the resolution of industrial disputes, working conditions, social security, and wages. However, up till 2013, the 2013 Act, there was no labor protection whatsoever available for sanitation workers. For the ease of compliance and to ensure uniformity in the laws, the government has attempted to consolidate 29 of these laws into broader groups, such as industrial relations, wages, social security, safety, welfare, and working conditions. Now, the latest code on occupational safety and health, which was drafted just a few years ago, this specifies some list of non-core activities where prohibition against contract labor will not apply. And this includes sanitation works, security services, and any activity of an intermittent nature, even if that constitutes a core activity of an establishment. So basically sanitation work, even the updated laws, is allowed to be contracted out, since it's considered an activity of intermittent nature, and which further enables avenues of abuse of power between employers and employees. So now these laws have been passed in the parliament, the updated labor codes, and all states are currently working on implementing them. However, the legislations that are currently active, these include the Employees Compensation Act, Bonded Labor Act, Contract Labor Abolition Act, Minimum Wages Act. Out of these, the Contract Labor Abolition and the Factories Act would in any case not have been applicable to the sanitation workers in the past, as they too specifically had excluded sanitation workers from the ambit of work of essential or perennial nature. Now, if it were possible for sanitation workers to prove an employer and employee relationship, then the payment of wages, minimum wage, or the Minimum Wages Act, the compensation under the Employees Compensation Act would be applicable for these workers. However, as we have seen in most of our cases, and as everybody has been stressing upon, there's just absolutely no accountability between employers and employees. Just figuring out where that relationship starts is a task in itself. So, for example, in the documentary, you saw the case of Vikas. He was not given a wage slip when he had been called. Vikas was a worker who died along with Sunny in the septic tank. So, and Vikas was the one who had been employed by the municipal corporation. So yeah, for the labor laws, the ESI contributions, employer state insurance contributions, they allow benefits such as medical benefits, pension, disability, which are to be given to all workers. Now, sanitation workers have always historically been excluded from this. Same goes for provident fund schemes. If a worker, the one thing that can apply to them is the Employees Compensation Act. So if a worker can prove that they did work from somebody, now nobody is going to jump into a septic tank on their own. So you don't really, it's a little easier to prove an employer-employee relationship there, proof of employment, so to say. So they can, compensation can be claimed in case of disability or death. And this is applicable for occupational health and diseases, including CVO workers. So the amount in this is quite less, but worth something. So, but for manual scavengers, the Supreme Court has been clear that there is no need to prove an employer-employee relationship, as the compensation becomes a task of the state. And so the reason as we have been stressing, there's been a rejection of constitutional goals, and within an economy of this kind of labor is dictated by caste politics and not constitutional directives. So, which is why individuals of this community have been trapped in doing sanitation work for generations. And my colleague Suresh would talk more about the 2013 Act, which is the chief legislation providing protection for these communities. Thank you.
Yeah, the PEMSR, the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavenger and the Rehabilitation Act, is passed with the Union of India government in 2013. The PMSC, generally in India, when sanitation workers or the manual scavengers are concerned, as Utkarsh has mentioned earlier, they don't have any labor protections. PMSR is one of the only acts which tries to provide some kind of labor protection, and it also states clearly. We can look at the screen for the definition of a manual scavenger according to the PMSR Act, who takes about who manually clean, carry, dispose, or otherwise handle any other in any manner human excreta in an insanitary latrine or an open drain. It also states that they are not just employed or engaged, even under a contract or a regular. It's also clear that the person who is engaged or employed to clean, etc., with the help of any other devices or any other safety equipment, who don't touch the human excreta or directly, they are not manual scavengers. So the notification is clear on these terms. The PMSR rule. The PMSR rules also state very clearly about there should be no manual contact with the sewage. And when it comes to septic tank cleaning, the PMSR rules lists at least 44 items, which include the protective gear and safety devices, which include basic items such as hand gloves, breath mask, face mask, 9-all belt, safety helmet, etc. All these needs to be provided by the employer in order for anybody to go to a septic tank cleaning. And in this very clearly, there should not be any direct contact with the sewage. And if in case there needs to be any person needs to be engaged for manually cleaning, there needs to be a specific approval on each case by the local head of the local authority. And they have to ensure cleaning devices, which include suction machine, jetting machine, shovels, etc. But in our fieldwork, what we have seen is on the ground, none of these are being followed. Most of the any private person could not engage any person as a manual scavenger to clean the septic tanks, but they are engaged and they are forced to do it. Even when they're engaged by the municipalities or by the local authorities, they don't provide them any of these list of items which are being provided. We can see in the case of Sunny, or in the case of, as we've seen in the documentary, in the case of Sunny or Vikas was employed by the municipality, but he was just asked to go to the place in order to clean it. He was not even provide any equipment. Leave about safety equipment, he was not even provided anything such as shovels or spades, etc., to clean them. This is the case. This is the same case in we can look at in the case of other person Govinda, when in the case of Govinda, who passed away in Fatehpur Sikri. See, the PMSR Act. The previous one, do. Yeah, next. Yes. The PMSR Act doesn't just talk about employment or prevention of employment as manual scavengers, but it also talks about rehabilitation, which is the most important part of this act. In this act, the state is supposed to ensure that there are no manual scavengers, and they need to be provided rehabilitation or alternative employment opportunities for them to come out of this vicious cycle. But if we see that, just for a case, for an example case basis, the procurement of sanitation related vehicles under NSK FDC. The NSK FDC is National Safai Karamchari Finance and Development Corporation. Under the NSK FTC in UP, Bihar, and Jharkhand, since the act passed in 2014 to 2018, the procurement of sanitary related vehicles is zero. The two schemes, the Sanitary Mart Scheme and the Green Business Scheme, which are implemented under the SRMS. SRMS is the Self-Employment Scheme for Rehabilitation of Manual Scavengers. From the financial year 2014-15 till 2017 is zero. The amount or the stipulated amount for educational loans, which needs to be provided for the kids of manual scavengers so that they don't need to continue this part of occupation, that has been zero. Even if the manual scavengers are provided any other employment or alternate employment, as Carlos was also mentioning, as Vidit was also mentioning, the discrimination is based on caste, where they are not able to provide any other, they are not able to take any other form of alternative employments. Even if they open a shops or such, they won't be able, the business is not able to continue, including in the case of Vikas. So the rehabilitation scheme also, whereas the rehabilitation schemes also talks about providing permanent employment along with compensation if somebody dies in a sewage tank. But it is the Nagar Panchayat. Nagar Panchayat gave a job to one of the family member of Vikas, which is a casual work, a contractual, or not even a written contract, a casual work, but in the same sanitation department. There's not even any other kind of work was given. It is the same case in the case of Raju Valmiki. The society said the wife of Raju Valmiki won't be able to handle this high work. We will be able to handle this high work. So they will be giving the jobs to their kids, but same in the sanitation work. The new scheme with Vidit mentioned about the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, in which they have institutionalized, it looks like it has institutionalized manual scavenging, where the septic tanks will be continuing and people will be forced to continue this kind of work. And this is also ensuring a vicious cycle of caste oppression, vicious cycle of caste forced occupations to continue. I think I'll stop here. We'll take up some of in the discussion part. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidit, Utkarsh and Suresh, for the work you've been doing on this sensitive topic. So we do have just a few minutes remaining, about 8 minutes before we need to close the session. So would anyone like to comment on what you've seen or raise any questions in the chat, or raise your hand so that we can take your questions or comments? I can't see any coming in at the moment. I'm sure everyone is also deeply shocked by what you've seen and heard now, but there is one, sorry, I can find now, from Nelly. So Nelly says, thank you for the powerful documentary and presentation, and quotes, the Supreme Court has charged the state to provide compensation rather than employers. Can you explain again how this is justified? It seems like the state is sponsoring and subsidizing lethal infrastructure and practices. So that is in the question and answer Q&A box. So I don't know if any of our speakers want to take that up.
See I'm taking the PEMSR Act. It completely abolishes manual scavenging. Any person who wants to engage privately also, they can engage sewage cleaning pumps, which has motorized vehicles to clean the septic tanks, but they cannot engage anyone so that go and do the manual scavenging work. And it is only the state, the local authority, the local administration, which would be able to, or which would be engaging people to go and do that. In this case, earlier, most of the cases before the Supreme Court judgment, Supreme Court of Indian judgment, many people tried to wish away their accountability, where private employees said that we didn't have any idea, or private employees didn't pay any kind of compensation. So the Supreme Court of India said that every case compensation has to be paid, whatever be the kind of employment. It didn't deny, or it didn't say that the employers should not be paying the compensation, but it said that the state has to ensure that the compensation has to be paid.
If I may add to that, Supreme Court has directed that 10 lakh compensation has to be paid to every victim of manual scavenging death. But as Utkarsh was talking about, that the nature of the contract is so informal between the employer and employee that establishing that in a court of law will be the most difficult task. So who is the employer, who is the contractor, who is the worker? In fact, everybody knows that, but you can't prove that in the court of law because there is no paper trail at all. Everything is just oral and informal. So identification of employer at times is a very difficult task, as we have seen in the police complaints. Who is the employer or who is the contractor? The names are missing because these are not identified through the document trail that they have. So punishment is a longer goal, I believe. Like, first is identification of who the accountable person is. So that's the nature of informality here in this. So this is a sanitation work. This is the most vulnerable section of sanitation workers also. So that's the degree of informality here. It's everything involving petty cash, oral contracts, oral verbal agreements. They are not even contracts. They're just agreements that we have this to do. We can do that for, let's say, 500 rupees, which is what? Which is like 5 pounds. So that's the nature of informality that we are dealing with here.
If I can just add one line, I think that it does reflect, on the one hand, it seems a compassionate move that at least the family should be assisted because of the nature of informality that Vidit and Suresh described. But I do think that it is, it in a sense is accepting the reality of the failure of the application of any kind of labor protections for this community. And what really the state, the court should have done was to ensure a mechanism by which labor laws are applied, and therefore you can hold the employer accountable for compensation. So in a sense, it's a good thing, but it's also in a sense accepting the reality of this extremely oppressive informal kind of work.
Thank you very much, Harsh, Vidit and Suresh, for your comments on that. We don't have long left, so I think, again, if there's any other questions, they might have to wait for another time. But just to end in the last few minutes, would any of our speakers like to say a few final words? We still have the two Davids here with us as well. So if any of you would like to say a few final words before our close, then the floor is yours.
Well, I'm afraid that you can't ever offer me the floor and not have me say something, but okay, there's my video. Look, to me, it sounds as if, there's a lot of technical legal issues, there's a lot of research and whatever, but what we need is political will. We need to make sure that our local institutions in their daily practices accept their responsibilities and the responsibilities that the people assign to them. Look, I don't have a magic solution for every country. What working in PSI has shown me is that I need to be extremely humble, because every time I go to another country, I learn something new that I didn't know about them. But what I do know is that we, as workers and as members of the community, we need to make our voices heard. Thanks very much.
Can I just add that in addition to political will, I think even more it is social will to fight this kind of social degradation of people, I thought I'd leave you with a thought that I heard in Pakistan, where the Christian community called Chudas are compelled to do this work in exactly, they were converts from the Hindu former untouchable castes. So a Chuda boy comes first in class, and he comes home very distressed, and he says, it is the most humiliating day of my life that I came first in class. And he said the teacher, when he read out that he had come first, he said, the rest of you should be ashamed that a Chuda can do better than you. And so I think it is, political will come out of a social process of the equality and dignity of all human beings, and it's a civilizational battle that we need to recognize. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, David. And I think there's nothing much more to say. I think that is a very good point in which to end the workshop on labour rights and sanitation. So thank you again to all of our speakers for your excellent work and commitment to this topic. And again, thank you. We will carry on these conversations. We'll also post this recording onto the platform for others to watch and engage with. So thank you again all, and thank you to Purva for running the tech. And also thank you to all of our participants for sticking with us today. So thank you, and Purva, please do close the recording now.
Thanks much.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Thank you,
everybody.
David.